Rome was not ruled by its emperors alone, nor by its mobs, nor by its armies. For most of its history, Rome was ruled by a tiny, fiercely competitive, obsessively status-conscious aristocracy, a few hundred families who controlled the wealth, the offices, the armies, and the destiny of the greatest empire of the ancient world. They were not aristocrats in the way a medieval duke was an aristocrat. There were no kings to grant them titles, and for centuries Rome despised the very idea of monarchy. Instead, the Roman aristocracy was something stranger and more brutal, a hereditary elite that nonetheless had to constantly earn and re-earn its status through a savage lifelong competition for honor, office, and glory. To be born into this class was to inherit not a guaranteed life of ease, but an obligation to compete, to climb, to win, or to disgrace your ancestors forever. Today, we are going to step inside the world of the Roman ruling class and understand how this small group of families actually worked, how they were ranked, how they competed, how they got rich, how they held power, and what it really meant to be one of the masters of Rome. Using advanced AI trained on the writings of Roman senators like Cicero and Pliny the Younger, the inscriptions that recorded the careers of the Roman elite, the archaeology of their townhouses and country villas, and the work of modern historians of Roman society, we have reconstructed how the Roman aristocracy was built. The first thing to understand is that it was not one single group, but a series of carefully ranked layers, and that where you stood in that ranking was, for these people, the most important fact about your entire existence. At the very top stood the senatorial order. These were the families whose members sat in the Senate, the great council that for centuries governed Rome. To belong to the senatorial order, you needed enormous wealth far above a high property threshold set by law, and that wealth had to come from the right sources, principally from land. A Roman senator was supposed to be a gentleman of leisure and dignity, supported by the income of his vast agricultural estates, worked by armies of slaves and tenant farmers. He was not supposed to dirty his hands with trade or commerce, which the aristocracy regarded as beneath them, even as many of them made fortunes through it quietly, behind the scenes, using freed slaves and middlemen to do the unseemly work of business. The senators wore a distinctive toga with a broad purple stripe, special senatorial shoes, and a gold ring, badges of rank that announced their supreme status to everyone they passed. Below the senators stood the equestrian order, the so-called knights. These were also wealthy men with their own slightly lower property requirement and their own narrower purple stripe, but they were the businessmen, the financiers, the tax collectors, the bankers, and the imperial administrators of the Roman world. The equestrians were where much of the real money was made, and a successful equestrian family could, over generations, accumulate enough wealth and prestige to push its way up into the senatorial order itself, just as a senatorial family that fell on hard times could slip back down. The boundary between the orders was real, marked by law and by display, but it was also permeable to the very rich and the very ambitious. But within the senatorial elite itself, there was a further, crucial distinction that obsessed these families above all else. It was the distinction between the old families and the new men. The highest prestige of all belonged to the nobiles, the nobility, families that could boast that one of their ancestors had held the consulship, the highest elected office in Rome. These families guarded their prestige jealously, displaying in the entrance halls of their homes the wax death masks of their illustrious ancestors, the imagines, which were paraded through the streets at family funerals so that the glorious dead could escort the newly deceased and remind all of Rome of the family's ancient greatness. A man whose family had never held the consulship, who was the first of his line to climb to the top, was called a new man, and no matter how brilliant or wealthy he became, he carried a faint stigma, a sense that he was an upstart among the truly great. The famous orator Cicero, one of the most gifted men Rome ever produced, was a new man, and the sneers of the old nobility at his lack of ancestors wounded him his entire life. The entire purpose of an aristocratic Roman's public life was to climb a ladder of offices known as the Cursus Honorum, the course of honors. This was a fixed sequence of elected public positions that an ambitious aristocrat was expected to hold in order over the course of his career, with minimum ages set by law for each step. A young man would begin with junior magistracies and military service. then move up to financial offices, then to positions that involved organizing public games and overseeing the city, then to a senior judicial and governing office, and finally, if he was successful and fortunate, to the consulship, the summit of the entire system, the office held by only 2 men each year. Each step up the ladder was won by election, which meant that an aristocrat's whole life was an unending campaign for votes, prestige, and the favor of the people and his peers. To reach the consulship was to achieve the highest honor a Roman could attain, to crown your family with glory, and to earn the right to have your name remembered forever. To fail, to stall partway up the ladder, was a quiet, lifelong shame. The fuel of this entire system was a relationship the Romans called patronage. Roman society was bound together, top to bottom, by the bond between patron and client. A powerful aristocrat, the patron, surrounded himself with a crowd of dependents, the clients, men of lower status who owed him loyalty and service, and to whom he owed protection and favors in return. Every morning, in a ritual called the salutatio, the clients would gather in the entrance hall of their patron's house to greet him, to ask for his help with their problems, a lawsuit, a debt, a job, and to receive in return small gifts of food or money and the priceless benefit of his influence. In exchange, the clients formed the patron's political base. They voted as he directed. They cheered him in the streets. They spread his reputation. They escorted him through the city in a great crowd, and the size of a man's morning crowd of clients was a visible measure of his power. The greatest aristocrats had hundreds of clients, including lesser aristocrats who were themselves patrons to others, so that all of Roman society was woven together into a vast, interlocking web of obligation, with the great senatorial families sitting at the center of it like spiders at the heart of their webs. The wealth that made all of this possible was, above all, land. The Roman aristocracy owned vast agricultural estates scattered across Italy and, increasingly, across the conquered provinces of the empire. These estates produced grain, wine, olive oil, and other goods, worked by enormous numbers of enslaved people, the labor force on which the entire Roman economy rested. A great senator might own estates in a dozen different regions, along with herds of animals, mines, brickworks, and rental properties, including the crowded apartment blocks of the cities, where the urban poor paid rent to live in flimsy, fire-prone buildings owned by men they would never meet. The income from all this flowed into the aristocrat's coffers and funded his magnificent lifestyle. The townhouse in Rome, decorated with marble and mosaics, the string of luxurious country villas where he escaped the summer heat, the slaves, the banquets, the games he sponsored to win the people's favor, and the bribes and gifts that lubricated his political career. The Roman aristocrat's wealth was, in a real sense, a machine for producing political power, and his political power was, in turn, a machine for producing more wealth through the governorships of provinces that could be ruthlessly exploited for personal profit. And there was a dark engine at the heart of this competition. Because the prizes were so great and the contest so fierce, Roman aristocratic politics was savagely, sometimes lethally, competitive. Aristocrats borrowed staggering sums to fund their campaigns and their games, gambling that the offices they won would let them recoup the costs many times over. Some bankrupted themselves and their families. The competition for office spilled over, in the late Republic, into bribery, intimidation, street violence, and eventually into civil war, as the greatest aristocrats, men like Caesar and Pompey, raised personal armies and turned the whole system into a fight to the death. When the Republic finally collapsed and the emperors took power, the aristocracy did not disappear, but its role changed. The fierce open competition for the consulship gave way to a more dangerous game of currying favor with the emperor, in which the wrong word, the wrong friendship, or simply being too rich and too prominent could mean exile, forced suicide, or execution. Many of the proudest families of old Rome were extinguished in the purges of suspicious emperors. That was the Roman aristocracy. A small, immensely wealthy, obsessively status-conscious ruling class, bound together and divided against itself by an endless competition for honor, office, and glory. They inherited their wealth and their status, but they were never allowed to simply rest on it. They were driven by the deepest values of their culture to climb the ladder of offices, to outshine their rivals, to add new glory to their ancestors' names, and to avoid, at all costs, the shame of falling short. They governed an empire, commanded its armies, exploited its provinces, sponsored its games, built its monuments, and wove its entire society together through the bonds of patronage. And in the end, the same fierce ambition that made them the masters of the world also tore the Republic apart, as the greatest of them turned their armies against each other and against the state itself. The marble busts of these proud, hard, ambitious men still stare out at us from the museums of the world, with their stern faces and their knowing eyes. They were the ruling class of Rome, and for better and for worse, the world they built and fought over still echoes through our own.